So what makes a good disaster movie? And I'm talking about the bare essentials here. There's really only two requirements. First and foremost is the disaster itself. Audiences go into these movies expecting exciting disaster sequences, so you gotta give them what they want. If you don't, they're gonna be disappointed. If that sounds obvious, well, yeah, I suppose it is. Even lousy disaster movies usually get this step right. It's the second requirement where they often screw up. Audiences may want exciting disaster sequences, but they're only going to care about them in accordance with how much they care about the characters those disasters affect. If the characters aren't compelling, the disaster likely won't be either. As to how to create compelling characters, there's no easy answer, but the great Kurt Vonnegut did provide a simple but profound maxim when he said, "Every character should want something even if it's only a glass of water." This is great advice because if we know what the characters want and we understand the obstacles in their way, we'll likely develop a vested interest in whether or not they succeed. The disaster sequences in Titanic, for instance, are all excellent, but they wouldn't have mattered to us if we didn't care about Jack and Rose, which we did mainly because we understood what they wanted and what was standing in their way. While Titanic and Twister both combine the disaster movie and the love story to great effect, their approaches to those stories are completely different. In Titanic, Jack and Rose meet, they fall in love, the disaster strikes, and then they're torn apart. Such a conventional approach wouldn't work in Twister, since the entire love story centers around whether Bill and Joe are going to get together at all. If these two met the same way that Jack and Rose did at the start, it would be way too obvious what's going to happen. As for the disaster story, Titanic's approach wouldn't work there either. In that film, and in most disaster movies, the disaster comes to the characters. It traps them, which adds to the tension. In Twister, however, the characters are literally chasing the disaster, meaning at any point they could just stop. This had the potential to rob the film of tension. To prevent that, Anne-Marie Martin and the late great Michael Crichton really took Vonnegut's maxim to heart, and they did something else interesting as well. In addition to combining the disaster film and the love story, Twister also borrowed from the monster movie genre.
It's coming! It's headed right for us! It's already here!
Watching it, I couldn't help but be reminded of Jaws. Just look at how the two films begin. In Twister, this little girl watches in horror as her dad essentially gets eaten by a tornado that we don't really get to see, which is eerily reminiscent of Jaws, which starts with this teenager going for an ill-advised swim in the middle of the night. Beyond these excellent preludes, both films also feature a money-hungry moron whose greed winds up getting people killed,
Why aren't you in the water?
a vulnerable family member whom the monster nearly takes out,
I'm all right, I'm fine. He's dead.
No, he's not. He's in shock.
and a final showdown in which the hunters become the hunted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Again, we wouldn't care about any of this if we didn't care about the characters, so let's take a closer look at how the story introduces us to its key players, starting with Bill and his fiancée Melissa. These two are here to pick up divorce papers from Bill's estranged wife Joe, who's readying her team of researchers to go out and study tornadoes, which we've just been told are going to be especially prevalent over the next 48 hours. This is good news for Joe and her team because they're about to launch Dorothy, an invention of hers and Bill's which is going to measure tornadoes in a way that's never been done before. Bill lights up when he sees Dorothy, just as everyone else lights up when they see Bill, assuming he's here to rejoin the team. When Bill tells Joe why he is here, she's disappointed but still appears to give him what he wants, except one of the pages isn't signed. Joe claims this is a mistake, but before she can correct it, the team gets the call and off they go with Bill not getting what he came for.
Did she sign papers?
Oh, shit!
She didn't?
This introduction is masterful. Consider all the information it gives us. We know Bill and Melissa want to get married, which puts them at odds with Joe. We know Joe doesn't want Bill and Melissa to get married, which puts her at odds with them and with her own reluctance to let go. We know the team wants Bill back, which puts them at odds with Bill's insistence that he isn't.
Bill, glad you're back! I'm not back!
And despite that insistence, it's clear Bill wants to see Dorothy fly as badly as everyone, which puts everyone at odds with how dangerous and unpredictable tornadoes are, and puts Bill at odds with himself. He's stuck between his desire to fulfill the ultimate goal of his old life with Joe and his desire to start a new life with Melissa, who's a lot more important to this movie than you might think. Again, if Bill and Joe met the same way that Jack and Rose did, it would be way too obvious what's going to happen. Even if we learned Bill was engaged to Melissa, but she wasn't actually here, and Bill showed up wanting signing his divorce papers, and Joe was like, okay, I'll give them to you, but we gotta go chase this tornado first, why don't you tag along? We'd be like, come on, we know where this is headed. But since Melissa is actually here in the flesh, and since Bill's affection for her is genuine, and because she's relatable and sympathetic rather than annoying and unnecessary, she presents a real obstacle, and that's not the only critical role that she plays. Melissa is also what you call the Watson. She's the outsider, the non-expert, the person that when the experts talk to, they have to speak in layman's terms, which allows us, the audience, to understand what's happening.
Wow, it is great. What is it?
Melissa's presence is why we know the exact purpose of Dorothy so quickly, which is crucial since the mission to launch Dorothy is really the driving force of the story. It's what brings all the characters together. Without Melissa, this scene would just be a bunch of experts talking to each other, and experts don't talk in layman's terms. These guys would never say to each other, okay, so we're gonna put Dorothy in front of a tornado, these balls are gonna come flying out, and we're gonna use them to measure stuff. But they would say it to Melissa, which leaves us wondering if and how they're going to be successful. This scene also leaves us wondering if Bill is going to rejoin the team. If he does, what does that mean for Melissa? What does it mean for Joe? And why did these two break up in the first place? These are all great questions because they enlist us, the audience, in bringing the characters to life. However, impressive as this introduction is, it's still missing something. Even though these guys got the call to go tornado chasing, they're not ready to do so just yet. Remember, our two main requirements for a good disaster movie are exciting disaster sequences and characters worth caring about. While this scene definitely gave us the second, it didn't give Bill a reason to take part in the first. The only reason he's still here is because Joe didn't sign this last page. If she had, Bill and Melissa likely would have left right then. In order for Bill to go from reluctantly following his old team to actively taking part in their mission, something has to push him over the edge. And that's when we meet this guy.
Son of a bitch!
Bill may have been willing to leave the launching of Dorothy to Joe and her team, but he's not willing to lose to Jonas. Just the sight of him makes Bill want to throw down. What exactly did Jonas do to make Bill so upset? Well, for one, he stole Bill's idea. Jonas's tornado measuring contraption looks very similar to Dorothy, which presents yet another obstacle to our protagonists. In order for them to measure tornadoes in a way that's never been done before, in addition to the challenges they already face, they now have to beat Jonas, who makes an excellent antagonist. Instead of being soft-spoken and humble, Jonas is bossy and arrogant.
When I want your opinion, I'll give it to you.
Whereas Team Joe is comprised of this ragtag group of misfits on a shoestring budget who love what they do, Team Jonas is comprised of these joyless drones in fancy SUVs who are only in it for the money.
He's in it for the money, not the science.
Most importantly, despite his huge financial advantage, Jonas is neither as smart
He's gonna wait and see what Bill does.
nor as ethical
Maybe we should stop, see if they need some help.
as Bill and Joe. These qualities, or lack thereof, make Jonas less deserving, both to us and to Bill, of winning the race to launch Dorothy. Jonas is the final piece the story needed to set the plot in motion. But though Bill's return answers the question of whether or not he's back, it still leaves us wondering if his move is permanent, what that means for him and Melissa, and what it means for him and Joe. After all, this is more her team than it is his. In order for Operation Dorothy to be a success, these two are going to have to work together, which we quickly learn is not their natural state.
You asked me!
As we watch them fight over every little thing, with neither giving an inch, neither admitting fault, or even acknowledging the other's point of view, it starts to become clear why their marriage fell apart.
Can I drive?
No!
Then would you?
Whoa!
And how Bill subsequently wound up with someone like Melissa. After being with someone so reckless and psychologically damaged, it's understandable why he'd then fall for someone who's risk-averse and emotionally stable. But while Bill's relationship with Melissa is a lot less volatile than his relationship with Joe, it's unlikely these two would have worked out in the long term.
I really enjoy your weather reports.
I have a hard time believing Bill would be satisfied living the quiet life of a weatherman when the exciting life of a tornado chaser suits him so well. And since Melissa is clearly not cut out for that life, not only would she not be joining Bill on these excursions, she'd likely try to dissuade him from going on them as well. I'm not a couples counselor, but I feel confident saying that if the person you're with doesn't want you doing the thing that you like doing the most, it doesn't bode well for your relationship, something Melissa, who is a couples counselor,
She's a reproductive therapist.
is quick to realize.
I can't compete with this.
For better or for worse, Bill and Joe just make too much sense together, which means the only chance they have at both personal happiness and professional success is to stop working against each other. At first, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. They keep fighting, and their attempts to launch Dorothy keep failing, but little by little they start to learn from their mistakes, first realizing the reason Dorothy keeps tipping over is because she's too light.
Too late?
I don't know, maybe the whole thing's too light.
And then realizing that these sensor balls need something to make them more pliable.
I know how to make Dorothy fly.
Watching these two deal with their problems in a constructive rather than destructive manner is really engaging, and that's not just because it addresses the central question of whether they'll be able to launch Dorothy. Again, if the disaster alone dominates our interest, then the story likely won't be very compelling. But here, we're not just watching Bill and Joe try to launch Dorothy, we're watching them learn to trust each other, to listen to each other, be supportive of each other, and cooperate with each other. Factors that won't just lead to a successful tornado chasing operation, they'll lead to a successful relationship. That's really the genius of Twister. The love story and the disaster story are the same story. Bill and Joe aren't just chasing tornadoes, they're saving their marriage. I have to take my hat off to the writers here, not just for combining these two central conflicts, but for recognizing that good conflicts are never easily resolved. If all Bill and Joe needed to get back together was the power of love and teamwork, their story would be too predictable. Again, we don't learn if they get back together until the very end. To sustain that storyline for so long, something else had to keep these two apart. We get our first glimpse of what that something is during Bill and Joe's first attempt to launch Dorothy. While it's clear that Bill is willing to take some risks in order to get what he wants, it's also clear that Joe's willingness to take risks borders on suicidal. It's all Bill can do to keep Joe from sacrificing herself, and this is after Dorothy's been lost and the mission has no chance of success. We find out the reason for Joe's obsessive behavior during this exposition break at her Aunt Meg's house. Here the team explains to our trusty Watson that tornadoes measure from F1 up to F5, which again they would never say to each other.
Little encounter we had back there's a strong F2, F3 maybe.
Bet we see some F4s today.
F4 will relocate your house fairly efficiently.
Is there an F5?
This layman's explanation does more than just keep us informed, it also serves as a form of foreshadowing since it tells us the tornadoes we've seen so far aren't the biggest ones out there, which builds anticipation for what's to come. And then Melissa asks,
None of you have ever seen an F5?
Just one of us.
This leads to the big reveal that Joe was the little girl in the beginning. This explains everything. Chasing tornadoes goes far beyond thrill-seeking or a fascination with extreme weather or even a desire to help people. For Joe, this is a vengeful crusade against a malevolent monster that killed her father, and that crusade is bound to end in disappointment because it won't bring her father back. Even if they successfully launch Dorothy, Joe won't be at peace until she lets go of the past, something Bill wants to help her do.
Stop living in the past and look at what you got right in front of you.
What do you say?
Me, Joe.
But that Joe ultimately does on her own, ironically by signing the final page of her and Bill's divorce papers, which actually brings them closer together. They no longer resent each other or have an unhealthy dependence on each other. Instead, they're a team. With their mistakes learned from and their modifications implemented, Bill and Joe finally launch Dorothy. Then, when the tornado starts chasing them, they're able to work together to survive, which leads to this epic scene in which Joe realizes that even though tornadoes are devastatingly destructive, they're not evil, they're miracles of nature. With Dorothy successfully launched, and Joe having achieved catharsis, and Melissa having bowed out of the Bill sweepstakes, and Jonas having stupidly gotten himself killed, the obstacles that kept Bill and Joe apart have all been overcome, and they can finally be together. Now, if I wanted to ruin this romantic moment, I'd point out that these two should probably be deaf, blind, and covered in skin lacerations at this point, and that it's pretty convenient that they were able to outrun a mile-wide tornado on foot that they previously struggled to keep up with in a car, and that if the wind in this earlier scene was strong enough to pick up a cow, it likely would have picked up their truck as well, but I won't. The science of Twister is not perfect, but it's still an excellent disaster movie. In fact, it's an excellent movie, period.